Just a little housekeeping to get us started. So everyone's joined the webinar. Future webinars in the series, if you go to the landing page for that webinar, you'll find a link to export to calendar, so you can have a little calendar reminder for yourself. And we will be adding the slides to from the presentation today on the spot where you joined. So I'll be saving those, adding that PDF while we present. And just to remind you, this is the second webinar in a 6-part series on silvopasture created by a team of extension professionals from as far west as Missouri and far north as Cornell, all the way down to South Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, Virginia, and more. So we've got a great series and continuing on for the next 4 Tuesdays. And just a reminder that as you if you want to get continuing education credits or certificate from today's webinar, then you'll go to this screen, which came up when you first joined the webinar, and press complete the webinar. This will also take you to an evaluation where you can provide feedback on the webinar, which we always appreciate. And finally, this is the team of folks who have worked together to put this webinar series together. This is the 6th year of the Woodland Stewards webinar series. Each year is a slightly different theme and a bunch of different webinars that are relevant for forest landowners or landowners of all types. So now I'm going to hand it over to our presenter today, Colby Lambert. You can ask questions via the Q&A. That's preferable. You can enter those questions at any point, and after the presentation is done, we'll answer as many questions as time allows. All right, thanks, Colby. I'll let you start sharing now.
All right. Slides good. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Colby Lambert. I'm a area specialized agent for forestry for North Carolina State Extension Forestry, and coming to you from close to Raleigh this morning. So a lot of what I'm focusing on will be pine silvopasture establishment from a southern pine standpoint, loblolly, and talk a little bit about longleaf. We also have Buren Lanier with us this morning, who is a landowner in Pender County down near the southeastern coast of North Carolina. And Buren has been at this for many years, so he's the expert, and I'm just the talking head this morning. So this presentation that I put together worked with a livestock agent here in the county that I'm housed in, and we put this together to help train agents, especially livestock agents around the state on silvopasture establishment and management. So silvopasture, to recap from last week, it's basically a system of trees, livestock, and forages that's integrated into a single system on one site. So it's it's a combination of these things to help not only feed the cattle, but also to utilize the space under the trees as well. So some of the biggest concerns that I have as a forester with silvopasture is, basically stress on the trees from the compaction, potential for damaged roots, potential for insects and diseases. So that's why you can't leave the animals out there in one place for long periods of time. So again, we say it's not just, fencing in the woods and letting the cows or sheep or goats run through there, but it's a managed system that you have to be willing to manage it. The other thing is what kind of tree species to use if we're planting. We always say to match the tree to the site. And again, today we'll be talking mainly about pine. But I know one thing that Buren has stressed whenever Brian and I have talked to him several times is making sure that the forest is operational for timber harvest, for thinning, whatever you need to do operationally for that forest. Make sure that your fencing is oriented to where it makes it a little easier to do. So looking at tree spacing for silvopasture, I think it's more than just, you know, figuring out how many trees per acre or basal area. Basically was the key with silvopasture is manipulating the sunlight or the shade that's hitting the ground for your forage. So basal area and trees per acre are not quite as critical. They're just basically a reference point, but the main thing is really just getting that shade or the amount of sunlight that you need to make that forage grow. So here, we look at traditional lower densities than traditional forest. You're going to start with 300 to 400 trees per acre. You want to thin it over time to 50 to 150 trees per acre. I think, Buren, correct me if I'm wrong, you're shooting for about 80 trees per acre.
Yeah, at final, when that stand is mature, you're going to be looking at somewhere around 80 to 90 trees per acre. In our environment with loblolly.
Yep. So, and a lot of this is going to depend on what type of grass that you're trying to grow. If it's a warm season grass, you may not have as many trees out there as you would with a cool season grass. So tree spacing, if you're planting trees, you want to look at probably a double row system is considered optimum. As you look, if I can get my pointer. So if you look at this where you've got, triple, quadruple rows or even more, you're going to start to see some differences in growth of those trees. So a double row system like this here would probably be the optimum way to go. Here's just a diagram of traditional silvopasture spacing if you're planting trees in a pasture. You're looking at about 250 trees per acre. With the rows, you've got 30 to 40 feet in between the tree rows where you've got the forage established or already there. And again, you want to make sure that you've got it oriented to where you can do the work that you need to do in those trees. And this is hard to see, but if you look, there's actually cows up under these shade trees back in here. They're Black Angus, so they're hard to see in the shade. But this is just a picture of the cows. They like the shade, especially on real sunny, hot days. So that's where they're going to be. And that's what you're trying to achieve with this silvopasture system is, getting those cows some shade to where they can continue to eat and make gains. Again, with tree spacing, you're looking at trees planted 10 to 12 feet apart in a row. It can be the rows about 10 feet apart, but this, depending on your situation, you may want to do it a little bit different. The first thinning, you want to take out about every fourth row, and then in the second thinning, every second row. So you're looking at a fairly thin stand whenever you get back, and this is looking at a fully stocked stand, not in a pasture. So this will be going from a plantation back into thinning it down for the silvopasture. So this type of thinning would probably give you the best mix of trees and grass in a southern pine, loblolly pine situation. And you want to, I always stress this, make sure that you got the trees oriented to where you can make it operational. And in some cases, you may want to take, if we're looking at a forest situation where you're looking at a existing stand, you may just want to randomly thin that existing stand. Sometimes we do what we call a corridor thin, and I have worked with some producers on doing silvopasture where they've done some corridor thinning to create some openings in a naturally regenerated stand. You can just start with some single rows. You may want to match the tree spacing to the farm equipment that you're using. If you're tractors and hay equipment, or, bush hog, whatever you're doing. Silvopasture does work better when the trees are in rows. Again, if you're doing an existing stand that is a naturally regenerated stand, it may cause a little more challenges than if it's a plantation. So looking at natural stands, we're looking at tree selection similar to a crop tree release, which will probably be talked about in the next section with hardwoods. But you want to make sure you identify your fastest growing, best straight trees, thin around those trees. We're looking to thin for light tree quality, and this is a way to, because what you ultimately want to end up with is some more straight pole logs. Here in the Southeast, our best market for pine is poles. And if you're using, if you've got somebody coming in with a chipper, you want to use loggers that tend to chip. And if you use chippers, if these loggers tend to chip more of those tree tops, you may lose a little bit of money on that pulpwood tonnage versus sending it out to roundwood. However, it does tend to make a cleaner thin or cut when you do use a chipper. And then looking at just the canopy, when the canopy closure begins reaching 50%, a thinning should be considered, and this is looking at a densiometer reading. You may want to look at a prescribed burn after thinning, but I would caution with doing prescribed burn after thinning. We usually want to wait a couple of years after we thin to do that burn, just to reduce the stress on the trees. And also, especially if you've got animals in there, that may cause a little bit of stress, depending on the type of rotational management you've got. Want to make sure that, if you're not working with a consultant, or even if you are working with a consultant, when you do a marked thinning, you want to make sure that you mark those trees not only at the chest level but ground level, just so that you can avoid trees getting taken out that shouldn't be. And then we always want to take the trees to the deck for limbing to avoid damage and debris. And the thing with doing thinnings with silvopasture is it may take a little time to find a logger that would be best suited for this. Not every logging operation is going to be conducive to doing this type of work, just because it is going to take more time. It's a little more tedious, and just depending on your situation, and Buren may talk about this a little bit more, but it may be, take a little more time to find someone to do it like it should be done, and to make it a little more cost effective for the landowner. Here's just a picture of a kind of a before and after a little bit. The picture on the left is basically where it started. Right after the thin, the landowner was starting to do some disking and cleaning up the roots, and then the other picture is where they've actually got the grass sown, and the grass is starting to come up a little bit. But it does take a lot of work to get to that point on the establishment part. So looking at the tree canopy, for warm season grasses, we're looking at 25–30% to 40–45% shade, depending on what type of warm season grass. For cool season grasses like fescue, you can go up to 40–60% shade, depending on the soil type and your environment. If you're in a Piedmont or mountains of North Carolina, you can certainly do a little bit more sunlight in that than you can on a cool season grass than you can, say, down toward the coast and in the coastal plain where the environment's a lot hotter. And then, when we're looking at how to measure that percent shade, we use a spherical densiometer. And basically this kind of tells you, you know, if you don't have one, you can work with a consultant, or you may be able to contact your local forestry agency. Here in North Carolina, ours is the North Carolina Forest Service, but you know, you can contact your local forestry agency and they may be able to come out and help you with figuring out these measurements with the densitometer. And then, you know, again, some of the concerns that we're looking at, especially depending on, you know, if you're looking at a warm season grass, you know, the wider we space these trees out, the more likely they are to develop more limbs. And you can see this is the open grown loblolly pine. It's basically limbs from the bottom to the top. And when we're trying to sell logs for lumber, you know, quality logs, knots are not what the sawmills want. So, you know, you may want to think about doing some tree pruning, and, you know, doing it at a young age confines those knots to a small diameter. And, you know, we're really only looking at trying to get pruning up to, you know, that first, basically that butt log, that first saw log, getting those knots out of it. But it also depends on what kind of equipment you have. You know, can you limb it up high enough for that equipment, but also will it pay for itself? And that just depends on basically, you know, your operation and what you're looking at for the final product that you've got. But tree pruning will probably be somewhat of a necessity, especially if the trees are at a wider spacing to begin with. And then we'll talk a little bit about site preparation, and what we're looking at here is disking, subsoiling or ripping, and then some of the herbicide treatments that goes along with that. Each of these methods are used to loosen the soil for good root growth and reduce the level of competition from grass and weeds from the trees until they become established. And the biggest thing that I like to stress to folks planting, especially planting in an existing pasture, is to subsoil. I've seen a lot of issues with longleaf pine CRP plantings over the years where they weren't subsoiled, and you have a very shallow root system on those trees that are very susceptible to wind throw. And in eastern North Carolina, we have a lot of these CRP plantings or pasture plantings are very susceptible to hurricane damage. So, you know, make sure that you get that subsoiler just as deep as you can in the ground, especially in sandier soils, to break up those hard pans or plow pans. And, you know, sometimes disking might be a you know, warranted depending on what kind of grass competition you've got. But we certainly do have a good mix of herbicides now that we can use. You can see here, this is a longleaf pine stand, but you know, we've got a lot of herbicides for herbaceous and grass weed control, Alstar, Milestone, for broadleaf weeds as well. Frequency is a real good for Bermuda grass control, especially in eastern North Carolina. We have you know, common Bermuda grass, or what we refer to as wiregrass. It's not the native wiregrass, but frequency is very good to help with that. You make sure you read the label on these herbicides. Some of them are, especially longleaf, are very specific on the timing of these herbicides. So you want to make sure that you are going by the label on those herbicides. But herbicides, again, can be very, very effective in helping with that competition control. You know, make sure that you use these treatments when you plant trees for better tree survival. Weeds often quickly reestablish in newly planted rows. after disking. And then in a lot of cases now we use banded or spot herbicides in the tree rows the first couple of years, and that's very, very effective in controlling that vegetation to get those trees established. Because the goal is to get the trees established and then get the forages established after that. But if you in some cases you may need to use a herbicide to start to get the forages established. So you want to make sure that the herbicides that you're using can be compatible with your tree seedlings. Newly planted seedlings are way more susceptible to herbicide drift damage. And sometimes even our older trees, especially loblolly pine, can be very susceptible to the contact herbicides like gramoxone. So you want to be careful when you're using those as well. And then mowing and haying, here's a silvopasture established. You got the trees established in the field, and if you don't want to spend the money on fencing those trees out to so that the cows won't mess them up, won't knock them down or rub on them before you get before the trees get big enough, you can go in and do some haying in there to defray costs before the cattle are allowed to go in the site. So looking at a couple of tree species here in the southeast, the one that we use is kind of our bread and butter pine species, loblolly pine. It's one of our fastest growing species. It's very versatile for a wide range of sites and site conditions, for soil pHs. It's one of our most commonly planted species here in North Carolina. And we do have a lot of improved varieties. We have, open pollinated. We have controlled pollinated. We even have some clones now, depending on how much money you want to spend. Make sure that you get fusiform resistant trees. And then, here we're looking at thinning for pulpwood in the coastal plain, 12 to 15 years, a little bit longer in the Piedmont. And then chip and saw and saw timber, 22 to 35 years. The good thing with loblolly pine is it will utilize a lot of fertilizer, a lot of nitrogen. So, if you're fertilizing that grass underneath, the trees will also benefit from it as well. Can be fertilized with 2 to 3 tons per acre of broiler litter. But the more branches you got can require more pruning. And then the trees need to be around 5 to 8 years old before you put animals in there, just to allow for the trees to get big enough that the animals won't mess them up. This is just a diagram of loblolly pine's native range, but it is certainly planted in a lot more areas now than that native range. The other one I want to talk about for just a few minutes is longleaf pine. And at one time this pine tree covered 2/3 of the southeast. It can be planted on a wide variety of soils, but it's very well suited for very dry, infertile, sandy soils. You will see it in some of our well-drained, more flood coastal plain soils as well, but it doesn't grow very well on flooded, saturated, or heavy clay soils. It does have a longer rotation cycle, but is a longer-lived pine tree than loblolly pine. So if you're looking to establish a silvopasture that you may want to keep the trees longer, then this might be something to look at. But it is a lot more difficult to establish than loblolly pine tree, and then loblolly pine, and it also requires more management. It does produce a very high quality timber, a lot of poles. Burning and herbicides can help get the trees up faster because they do have a grass stage where they're stay very small for a few years to get a root system established. Chip saw and saw timber is typically longer rotation than loblolly pine. And they also have produces high quality pine straw. Be very careful with fertilization though. You know, if you're going to have to fertilize your forages, loblolly pine is not a very high fertilizer utilizer. And then also they do like more of an acidic pH than loblolly pine. Loblolly pine is more adaptable to a higher pH. This is just showing the historic range of longleaf pine. And then one thing that I wanted to talk about, you know, longleaf pine, you're looking at 5 to 5.5 pH max. Well, this is the roots of grass. You know, we're looking at not a native grass, but you know, Bermuda grass, some of these others, and you can see as you get in that lower pH range, it really stunts the roots of the grass. So, you know, you have to look at this from the perspective of if you're trying to grow forages, unless you're going to do some native grasses, longleaf pine may not be the species to use, depending on what you're looking at. And few pictures. This is you know, one that silvopasture is getting started, where they utilize the mulcher to get things, you know, to get it cleaned up, to get the grass established. One thing I did want to point out in this slide, if you look at some of the trees in there, they're leaning over, very small diameters, very tall, very spindly. If you've got a stand like that you're looking to thin out for a silvopasture, I would recommend doing this in a two-step process. Do a light thin at first, so that the trees can get to get acclimated to being in a thinner environment, because once you take away a lot of their support system, you can end up having a lot of spindly trees. This particular producer had a lot of trees that they had to cut out of this stand just because they broke off, they bent over. So you can end up losing a lot of trees if you thin them out too heavy, too fast, especially in an existing stand. And then this is picture, Bjorn probably recognizes his picture. This is down at his place. And then, you know, one thing about it, once you get the forages started, you'll see, you know, you will see some sprouts, maples, sweet gums, but a lot of times the cows will help clean those up as they get in there and start foraging. You know, make sure that you try not to leave bad trees. You know, in some cases you may have to, depending on the spacing of the trees, but just realize that you may end up losing those trees over time. Here's one in Harnett County here where I live that, you know, I was really worried about this stand because it was really dry and hot when he started working up the ground to plant the grass, but really surprisingly, he lost very few trees in here. But you do want to be cautious around the roots whenever you're trying to get the seed bed prepared for the forages as well. And then this is one in a younger stand where we went in with a mulcher and tried to thinned out the trees, but this can be a very expensive process, you know, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. But it was like a 5-acre stand, so we really couldn't operationally get somebody in here to thin this, or a chipper, just because it's small. So we ended up using this mulcher, and just, you know, it takes a while and very expensive, but in the end it turned out to be pretty good. And then with that, I'm gonna, you know, we'll do questions in a little bit, but you know, in Florida, you never know what you're going to step on out in the cow pasture. So always look where you step, especially in Florida. But now I'm going to turn this over to Bjorn and let him talk, and take it away, sir.
All right. Thank you all for inviting me today. I kind of happened upon silvopasture as a necessity. as I come along as a third generation farmer on our farm, my dad had planted a lot of the erodible acres in what qualified as CRP. And it's been about 38 years ago when he planted those trees, and I came along about 20 years ago and started farming, and I inherited some 15 and 20-year-old stands that of pines that all the payments had run out on, and here we had this land, we had to figure out how to pay the taxes on it that had trees that weren't of any size to be harvested yet, but maybe could be thinned. So we started in our livestock operation about the same time, and in some of the open ground, because we were retiring as tobacco farmers and starting to looking into some other ways of making a living. And so we started running the cows in the woods and planting grass in there just to trying to have a place for them to be and to be able to utilize that land for other than waiting for a timber harvest. We found out that we learned a lot about density and about making alleyways to grow grass, and that there was all sorts of different ways of thinning, because we had a solid set like Colby talked about in the beginning there. It was a solid set of dense trees. And the first thinning, we took out about every fourth row, I think is what we did, left 3 rows. And then years later, we came back and thinned that again and took that middle row out. And so that left us 2 rows about 10, 20 feet apart, and then a wide middle between those 2 rows and the next 2 rows. Left us about 30 feet in there. And then we started to gain some success then. And now that our trees are mature, we've got this stand right here is mature enough to cut, but we don't really want to live in the middle of a cutover, and we like our silvopasture, so that we've got most of it thinned now to about 80 trees per acre, which seems to be what works in our environment down on the southeast coast. And we're able to grow grass when we get it down that thin. We started out growing cool season grasses in there, mostly fescue. And we were very successful at growing fescue in our silvopasture, but the problem was that's where our cows stayed all summer. So rotating them through fescue in the summertime tends to be pretty rough on fescue. So now we have done an about-face change, and all of our silvopasture is bahia grass, or bahia grass as some call it. We have experimented with about everything that'll grow in the southeast in our silvopasture. We've often planted Sudan grass. We've planted millet in there, and we're successful. But the silvopasture is not somewhere you want to be running with a seed drill a couple of times a year. So it's just a lot of issues with roots and stumps, tearing up equipment. I tear up a lot of equipment myself when I'm out in the middle of a big field, much less when I get in the woods. I tend to stop paying attention sometimes, and hitting trees with row markers and such is not a good thing. So we figured we need to have a permanent grass in there. So bahia grass now is our go-to for our silvopasture, because that's where the cows are in the summertime, and it's hard to damage bahia grass by grazing it in the summer. So the way we utilize our silvopasture, which we have about 125 acres under cultivation now, and we use it as a summer post for our cows, and it allows us to calve in late August and September. I wouldn't dream of doing that in the southeast where we are with 100-degree days and 99, 100% humidity. I wouldn't dream of calving at that time of year if I didn't have silvopasture. And the reason why I like to do that is because our market tends to peak around July, August, September. And we love to have 700 to 800 weight calves available. And to do that, we need to have calves available that size at that time. We need to be calving in late August and mostly in September. So the silvopasture allows us to do that. And we feel like we kind of hit those 700 to 800 calves hit the market at peak market time every year. And then we get rid of everybody in time to start calving again. And that allows us to have that silvopasture restored and back ready again for the cows to calve there in the fall. What we call fall, it's really late summer. What we do on our farm is we grow feeder calves that go, all natural feeder calves that go to anywhere from Maine. We've sent them to Maine, Nebraska, Canada. They go all over the place. We sell them on an internet sale, truckloads at the time. Last year we actually produced 2 truckloads. We had a truckload of just steers that went out and went to Nebraska, and then the same buyer bought the mixed load of heifers and steers. We also retain all of our own heifers on the farm, replacement heifers, and we'll usually retain more than what we actually need. We'll expose them to a bull at about 14 months of age and give them a bull for about 60 days. And then those that don't get bred during that cycle, we finish out for beeves. We're currently selling about 24 to 30 finished cows on our farm as well for meat sales off the farm. And that during COVID, that really springboarded that operation, and it has maintained as a good sales for us up through this year. So that's done primarily off the farm. We sell beef quarters, about 100 to 125 pounds of meat per customer. We have a retail site, our hardware store, that we sell individual cuts in, and that's mainly just so people can try it to make sure that grass-fed and grass-finished beef is something they like before they buy 125 pounds of it. These slides here, our breeding choice is Red Angus. We find that Red Angus cows are very efficient. They can operate in a hot environment, which we have, and they are able to calve and rebreed and produce a calf every year for us. We have started crossbreeding those cows with Charolais bulls. We're a little apprehensive to start with, but that gives us a lot better calf, calf with a lot more heterosis, and a little bit more quicker to get to that 700 to 800 pound weight by 10 to 11 months of age. So here you'll see the calves. These are heifer cows that are actually calving last year in that silvopasture. And it's just a world of difference to walk into that silvopasture from out in the non-shaded area. It's at least 7 to 8 degrees cooler in there. And a cow that's calving or in labor, she surely appreciates having that shade to be able to do that in. There's one actually had twins. That's not something we love to do, but a bonus is good if you can keep both of them alive. So this stand right here is probably one of our younger stands of trees. It's actually due to be thinned right now. We're trying to get a logger interested in coming in there and thinning it. However, the pulpwood market in our area has about been cut in half because of the closing of a mill. And pulpwood is hard for us to get rid of right now. But fortunately, a lot of these trees are of saw timber size right now. So we still hope to be able to get a pretty good amount of money for them. The hard part is to getting somebody to leave half of them and take half of them. Everybody wants to cut them all when they come. So like Colby mentioned before, it's very pertinent that you get the right logger to come in that will respect your fence post you leave up. You're going to have to get most of the wire out of his way and roll up out of the way, but it is nice to be able to leave the main corner post there and have a logger that won't tear all those up and that will take all of the debris to the deck where you can burn it and get rid of it and not be left out there to choke out your grass. So do we have any questions that may?
So Buren, if you don't mind, talk a little bit about, how you set up the water in on your
Okay.
on your operation as well.
All right. So one thing in our setup is about every block is probably divided in the biggest block of silvopasture we have is probably about 8 acres. We typically divide it up in about 4 to 5 acre blocks so that we can rotate. You know, every one of those blocks has a water in it. If those blocks will be inside of the main fencing, which is the perimeter of the farm, has a 3-wire hot wire fence around it. And then all of these little paddocks that are within may be just single wire paddocks, and the cows respect that if the wire's hot. As long as they can't get on the highway or completely out, you know, by those perimeter fences, those you can control them with single wire fencing for paddocks on the inside. And every paddock has a watering site, and most watering sites has 2 paddocks that share that one watering site. The other thing we do is we try to have a field of grass adjacent or a silvopasture that's adjacent to most of all of our other open field lots, so that even though we may not have enough grass for the cows to totally feed and live in the silvopasture, they have access to silvopasture when they're out in the big lots where most of the grass is grown. The thing you'll find with silvopasture is you can grow grass in a silvopasture where you may not be able to grow it. You'll never grow as much in the silvopasture as you do in the open fields because of the sunlight. But you can grow grass in there in the hot summertime when it's dry because of the shade. You'll grow a little bit more during that time in the silvopasture. And then in the winter, when the frost starts, the frost is delayed quite a bit in silvopasture. So on a bahia stand in a silvopasture, you may run into December before the frost actually takes that bahia grass in the silvopasture. Whereas out in the open fields, you know, early November, that grass is gone. So there's some advantages and disadvantages. It just works on our farm to have both available and to utilize the assets of both at the same time by making both available to the cattle at times.
I guess at this time we'll take any questions. So I'll go through some of the questions. So Buren, do you ever sell one-off feeder steers for small homesteads?
We're not selling feeder steers because it takes all that we can muster to make a truckload. And the way we go about doing that is we'll wean those calves in usually around the end of April. We'll wean. With the all natural program that we're on, they have to be of 6 months of age. You know, you can't be weaning anything less than 6 months. So we'll wean them at 6 months. Everybody will be at least 6 months when we wean. And then we put everybody we've got together, and we just keep weighing that group of steers. It usually takes about 60 to 65 to make a 50,000 pound truckload. So what we'll do is we'll put all of our steers together, and then we may supplement them with whole cottonseed while they're backgrounding. We'll do all of our vaccinations, and then we'll keep feeding that group and rotating them on our best grass until they reach the 50,000 pound mark. So the more we have, the quicker we can make a truckload, if that makes sense. And we get a premium price for them at that. We find that most of these homestead people or the people locally that want to buy calves aren't willing or don't have to pay as much to find a calf as the people out at, say, in the big feedlots in Nebraska that have contracts with Whole Foods and people like that. They just seem to be willing to pay a lot more for a calf than the local folks are. And having a truckload for them is nice to be able to get that money for all of them to go out on at one time. So.
Great. There was a question here about the stocking rate that you use.
Okay, say again. I'm having trouble hearing you.
No problem. There was a question about the stocking rate that you use.
Okay. So we have 400 acres of pasture under of land that's all fenced in and under pasture and grazing. We graze 365 days a year. The only supplementation we do is we use a little bit of cottonseed, whole cottonseed, to get through the winter, and we use gin fiber, gin trash, they call it, or it's the byproduct of the cotton gin. We'll use that instead of hay through the winter to stretch our grass. We like to have 2.5 to 3 acres per cow on our farm. So we calved 120 calves this fall, 120 cows this fall. And that's kind of a misleading number because we also have about 10 bulls. We also have 24 replacement heifers that are growing on our farm right now. And then we also, the maximum amount we'll have is about 25 to 30 cows that are finishing at the time. So if you add all those together, it's more like 2 acres. 2 acres per cow is our stocking rate.
So with an average of the small ones and the mature ones.
Yep. Yep. And finished cows take a lot of resources to finish a cow on grass. And it takes a lot for a cow-calf pair to make it through the winter as well. Heifers not so bad, and bulls don't eat that much either, but the cow-calf pairs are the biggest demand, and then the beef cows that we're finishing are the second in most demand. And then also, if you figure on backgrounding 100 calves to sell through the summer, at times we'll have 400 animals on the farm at one time. So,
right. There's a question here. This might be more for Colby, but they said they talked about burning after thinning, and someone wants to ask if there is noticed side effect of that fire on the remaining standing trees.
Yeah, so here in the southeast, especially loblolly pine, we generally do a prescribed burn after the first thinning on loblolly pine. So in that case, it would not, as long as the burn is done right, of course, it usually doesn't affect the loblolly pine, but we normally do wait till after that first thinning on loblolly pine. Of course, with longleaf pine, you can burn those a whole lot sooner than you can with loblolly pine. But in general, it doesn't bother it.
I would like to touch on that. I think if you burn during the cold times of the year, not when it's the middle of the summer, it's probably less drastic on loblolly. But you almost have to burn to get rid of all of that straw and that to get seed to soil contact. If you're going to try to plant grass, you almost have to do some burning to get rid of that bed of straw you got there before planting, is what I found.
Yeah, burning can be used as a nice preparation for seeding, so it makes sense.
Yeah, you can plant and plant and plant and try to disc all that straw in, and I don't know, it just leaves a dry environment to get seed started. And and you can put a lot of seed out there and still get a minimal stand. But if you burn, it seems like something comes up anyway. After you burn, it's going to turn green in a couple of weeks, the right time of the year, whether you plant anything or not. So you just utilize that. I don't know, that hot black covered ground that you get after it makes the soil warm up quicker in the spring. If it's black from a late winter burn, and it just makes things jump out the ground better, it looks like.
There's question or comment and question saying your system looks great, and do you have plans to replant to replace your oldest stand so that your silvopastures can be sustained?
Well, I keep flip-flopping that around. There's programs out there right now that'll pay you $2,300 an acre to plant trees. It's got me thinking about clear cutting some and replanting it. The problem is the particular area I'm in, the timber market is just kind of lousy right now, to be honest with you. Especially the pulpwood market, the big market over in Regalwood. The paper mill there just shut down half of its operation and half of its demand. So it's kind of got us in a tailspin right now as to what we're going to do. And advising my kids. I mean, let's face it, if I plant at 60 years old, if I plant another crop, I'm not planting it for me, of trees. And, it's hard for me to advise my kids on what to do right now with the land they may be inheriting or the land they may want to buy, as to whether they want to be in the timber business or not. So, we rely on the forestry department to help us out with those kind of the things. And NRCS, we got to address this market thing at some point. We pretty much know how to grow them and how to establish them and how to grow them and how to keep them, but we got to figure out how to get money paid for them. Now is what we need to programs to work on.
Absolutely. That's the discussion in every other forestry circle. We have another question here about someone says they have a 14-year-old plantation that they just third row thinned. And so the question is, what is the first step to get started establishing grasses and pasture? There's still some logging debris still scattered throughout the takeout rows.
Well, we did a lot of, during this time of doing the 100 acres on my farm, my kids were basically teenagers, and I had 3 of them, and they all did a turn out there walking and by a front end loader throwing limbs in there. So we did a lot of that. One of the best things I ever did was I found an old offset harrow, just made by Roan. And it's a heavy duty disc with a great big heavy axle, so that if you run over a stump, it doesn't ruin the disc. And pulling that over it, every time you pull that over it nice and slow and don't get real close to the trees, it will grind up a lot of that debris. A mulching head, a fecon head on a skid steer or on a skidder would certainly is the best way and the quickest way to establish it, but it's probably the most expensive way as well. But time will heal a lot of things, and patience usually burning and just doing what you can to get most of the logs and stuff out of the way. That land will that stuff will rot down and get where you can plant and do a light disking in there. And you don't have to disc it real heavy, and you don't have to disc real close to the trees. If you can get the majority of it done, a broadcast seeder will allow you to seed all the way across, even in between the small row, the close rows of trees. If some seed hit there on ground that's been recently burned, usually if it's in its right season and you get a little moisture, a lot of that seed will come up too.
Great. Let's see. And there was a question about, when you're doing your thinning, are you removing the stumps as well or grinding them down in place?
Well, fortunately, all of my trees were planted in rows. So they're in nice straight rows. And when we thinned, we'd take out a whole row at a time, kind of like the person that just asked the question and said they had taken out a third row. We farmed between the rows, if that makes sense. We didn't try to do away with those stumps the first year, especially on these smaller trees that are only 12, 14 years old, 15 years, those stumps are going to be gone in about 3 years. So there again, patience. You can get some grass established in the alleyways between the rows and leave that row of stumps. And then in about 3 years, when you're ready to renovate, that heavy disc, like I was talking about, would pretty much cut the top off of that row that's got the stumps in it. And then it'll be gone in 3-4 years. You won't even know that row was there. So that's where patience pays off.
Excellent. And there was a question here about do you overseed with winter annuals and or do you use legumes to help provide nitrogen? Do you fertilize?
Okay, so we have used annuals there. If silvopasture is the majority of ground that you got, I would highly recommend it. But if you've got open land, it just makes more sense to put most of your resources into open land, because it'll bring you back more of a return. Being that inputs are so expensive now, we've used lime. We always limed our silvopasture. We did a soil test and had to add lime before we could start really growing grasses. And usually about two 2 tons to the acre is what it took to get our silvopasture in order. And then usually 2 to 3 tons of poultry litter in there as well when we did our first planting. And that got the potash and the phosphorus amended as well, plus added some nitrogen. And I mean, I'm not against going over it every couple of years and putting the poultry litter out there if you can afford it. But there again, I tend more to spend more money on my open ground because it gets more sunlight and just produces more of a profit than silvopasture ground.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. We have a question here about any insights on end of timber rotation procedures. So I think we touched on that a little bit with replanting, but are there any other thoughts from you for Burren or Colby?
I mean, I think the main thing is just have a plan as to, if you are going to do a final harvest, how you're going to replant, or what are you going to do afterwards. Have a good plan. Work with a forester if you need to, your local forestry agency, and then figure out, work with a livestock agent or livestock person to figure out how the best way to handle moving forward with that. But having a plan is going to be key, I would imagine.
Yeah, pretty much anytime you're going to cut, you want to have a plan for what's going to happen next before you cut, so you get all your actions done at once.
Yeah.
There's one more question here about does the silvopasture system affect the quality of water bodies within the farm?
The quality of water, what?
It said water bodies, so any ponds or creeks or anything.
Well, I would, on my farm, the trees are where we had slope. In other words, that's what it qualified 35 years ago. That's what were the bases on whether you could do that and get in that program or not. It had to have slope. So it has definitely held. I can remember as a boy walking through these same places where these 38, 40-year-old stands of trees are now, and the huge gullies that were washed there because we were trying to farm tobacco on it. We were tilling the soil just to death. And there was huge gullies there, and it would fill in the ditches, and the erosion was just horrendous. And I remember it because that's where I learned to look for those sites for arrowheads. I always loved to look for Indian artifacts and arrowheads, and that's where you'd find them, is where the soil was eroding away. And my kids know nothing about that now because we don't have those huge erosion sites. So, everything's covered up with a bed of trees and grass, and we just don't have those erosion problems like there was 40, 50 years ago.
Makes sense to me. So better, less disturbance in the land. So you're going to get better water quality overall.
Absolutely.
Right. We are coming to the top of the hour. So I just want to thank our speakers, Burren Lanier for taking time out of his day to join us, and Colby Lambert, the extension agent from North Carolina State University, for also speaking as well. And he's also one of the co-organizers of this webinar series. This webinar will be available at the same location, the recording of it, in the next few days. And I just want to thank the team of professionals that has put together this series and previous series, and just tip you off that we have more webinars coming up. So we'll be looking more at hardwoods next week, followed by livestock, and then ideas and insights on finding help getting started. And then we're going to wrap up with a discussion bringing back some of our producers so they can answer some of your questions, since they have all the on-the-ground experience. And let's see, I'm just going to also remind you that if you do want to get a certificate for this webinar, or if you are want continuing education credits, that you follow the screen after you close the Zoom, and you'll see an orange button. You click complete webinar. That will take you to the evaluation for this webinar, as well as a place to get your certificate and your continuing education credits. And that is all. So thanks again, everybody. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Burren. Really appreciate it.
And Leslie.